Welcome to another thoroughly amateur production. No, I don't have a production company. I wouldn't know what to do with one if I had it. But I am a thorough amateur, and I'm going to go into a subject now at which I'm also an amateur, and that's whiskey. I began drinking whiskey in September of 2021. In fact, I can remember the date, the 20th was the day I bought my first bottle of whiskey since the 1970s, since 1979, in fact. And when I had my first drink of whiskey since no later than 1982. So I don't know much about it, but I'm like the stereotypical hick who goes to the museum, looks at the painting, says, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. Well, I don't know a ton about whiskey, but I know what I like. And I've got my various bottles over here, and I'll just grab them as they come, tell you a little bit about them, why I like them, move on to the next. This is not supposed to be some great educational thing. It's just me talking about something that interests me. And perhaps me talking about something that interests me will interest you. We'll see. First, then, we come to Maker's Mark 46. It is Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, barrel finished with 10 French oak staves. And the 46 refers to stave profile 46. They tested various things. What they did was they took their ordinary Maker's Mark bourbon and tried putting different staves from other barrels inside the bourbon barrel. And bourbon, by the way, according to law, there are various legal requirements. It has to come from a mash bill of at least 51% corn, has to age certain length of time, but the key here to what I'm saying is it must age in new charred oak barrels. But inside that barrel, you can put the staves from a sherry barrel or a champagne barrel or a rum barrel, whatever. And it's still legally bourbon. And they took various French oak staves. I don't know from what barrel. They tried various things. And they finished this bourbon, as they call it, finishing. They put the staves in the barrel, put the barrel not back in the regular barrel house, but into a cellar in a limestone hill, and under those cooler conditions, let that French oak put some of its flavor into the whiskey, and so we have the 46. Next up, George Dickel classic recipe number 8. How do they have it on the label? Tennessee Sour Mash Whiskey. And by the way, let me bring the 46 back up. I don't know if you can see it, but it has whiskey, W-I-S-K-Y, without an E. The George Dickel also has no E, W-H-I-S-K-Y. That's the Scottish spelling, and various other places may spell it without the E. W-H-I-S-K-E-Y originally comes from Ireland. Either is correct in the United States. Some distillers will do it without the E. Most put the E in. It turns out that my two favorite distillers both leave the E out, and we'll see that on the other one in a minute. But Tennessee whiskey is like bourbon with one difference. Every single thing else, mash bill, aging, proof coming off the still, proof going into the barrel, all this is exactly the same as bourbon, except that by Tennessee law, you cannot call it Tennessee whiskey without what they call the Lincoln County process. You take this big vat, they're 10 feet tall, full of ground maple charcoal, sugar maple charcoal, and you filter the whiskey down through that before it goes into the barrel. I have allergies. Thoroughly amateur productions, right? Other than that, Tennessee whiskey and bourbon are indistinguishable, and I cannot tell the difference from the taste. There are no doubt are people, real experts, who can taste what they call that charcoal mellowing that comes from the Lincoln County process. I can't. But this George Dickel number 8 is not bad whiskey. Set that aside. Now we come to my favorite distiller, Balcones Distilling in Waco, Texas, and this is their lineage. How do they put it? Texas single malt whiskey, and again, KY no E. How well that showed up, I don't know. Single malt whiskey is a 100% malted barley mash bill. And you get a lot of single malt coming out of Scotland. It's not quite so common in the States. But single malt whiskey is how Balcones got started. They are the first legal distillery in Texas since Prohibition, but Garrison Brothers can and does, rightly, nothing wrong with it, it's correct. Garrison Brothers does claim to be the first legal bourbon distillery in Texas. And they're in a little place called Hye, Texas, and Hye, Hye. And they're a small distillery. They don't seem too interested in growing beyond what they are, whereas Balcones has grown tremendously. But Balcones began with single malt whiskey, which is unusual in the United States. That's Scottish whiskey. They have single malts and a lot of blended stuff. But with that 100% malted barley mash bill, it gives an interesting spice. Now, rye whiskey is notorious for being spicy, and need to clear up my dry mouth here. But this malted barley is spicy in a different way. It's I don't know how to distinguish the two, but for me, and whiskey tasting, by the way, is very subjective. If two people taste this lineage, you'll get three opinions. That's how subjective it is. Years ago, when I was still a Baptist, I haven't been a member of a Baptist church in, criminy, 20 years maybe. But years ago, when I was a Baptist, they used to say, you get two Baptists together, you have three opinions. And it's that way with whiskey evaluation. But this lineage is mighty good stuff. Right now, it's my favorite of all whiskeys. And I keep having to arrange these bottles that I'm putting down over here. Next is another Balcones whiskey. It's their Baby Blue. It's corn whiskey. Now, bourbon and Tennessee whiskey have to have a mash bill of at least 51% corn. Corn whiskey, legally, the United States government regulates this, has to have a mash bill of at least 80% corn. And Balcones uses a mash bill of 100%. This Baby Blue has then that single grain mash bill, but it doesn't age very long. Balcones has an idiosyncratic way of stating their ages. This is aged at least 12 months in oak. Let me check the lineage there. This is aged at least 36 months in oak. And a year is 12 months, so the Baby Blue, at least a year. Simple division, even I can do it, and that's saying something. It's got to be simple if I can do the math. The lineage, 36 months, that's 3 years in oak. And here's another one that we'll get to in a moment. It says aged at least 1 day in oak. I'll talk about that if I remember when we get to it. But corn whiskey legally doesn't have to age at all. There's no minimum age requirement. But this stuff spends at least a year in the barrel. And judging by the fairly dark color, it's dark for a corn whiskey. I would say it probably spends at a little more than that. Although the climate in Texas is not the climate in the standard whiskey region of the United States, Kentucky and Tennessee. It does get hot in those states. It does get cold, but it doesn't have the wide swings of temperature that you get down in Texas. And that really changeable climate moves the whiskey in and out of the wood faster, and so you get this darker color than you would expect from a corn whiskey. But this is good stuff. This is, right now it's vying for second or third place in my litany of favorites. Now for that other bottle I said we would get to. This is also Balcones. It's Brimstone. And in case that didn't show up on the screen, it's made from roasted blue corn. It's a corn whiskey, 100% corn mash bill, pot distilled Texas scrub oak smoked whiskey. So it is a smoked corn whiskey. As I said, it's aged at least 1 day in oak. Now, that's a dark whiskey. That's darker than the lineage. I hope you can see just what the difference is in the darkness of the two. Lineage, Brimstone. In a better light, maybe you can see the color of it better there in the neck. But it's a dark whiskey, so I'm sure they age it more than the 1 day minimum they give you. Again, corn whiskey, there is no minimum age requirement by law. So you can take the white dog right off of the still, put it in a bottle, as long as it meets the proof and other legal requirements, and sell it as corn whiskey. But this stuff, and this may be part of why it's dark, I don't know, is smoked whiskey. Now, I keep intending to look up just exactly what a smoked whiskey is. I don't know. Like I say, I'm thoroughly amateur, not just in making videos, but in whiskey. But it definitely is a very smoky whiskey. However you smoke whiskey, I know how you smoke meat. How do you smoke whiskey? You can't hang it up there and let the smoke rise up through it. I know that. Somehow they must send it through a vat full of smoke or something. But it definitely has that smoky taste to it. And except for well, I didn't show you pot still bourbon. I was going to tell you about it, but I'm out of that, and I need to get another bottle. The first Balcones whiskey I had was their pot still bourbon, and it's as complex as any bourbon I've had. These corn whiskeys and the single malt, they're not that complex, but they're so vivid and so rich that you don't miss the complexity. Off of this Brimstone, I don't remember exactly, but I know I got smoke when I nosed it and tasted it. I got alcohol. I got I can't remember what else. And I've done a review of it. You can find it on either BitChute or YouTube. Don't ask me the channel names. Well, on BitChute, Texas Tar Heel, because I'm a Texan with ancestors in North Carolina who served in the Confederate States Army. But I did a review of this, and you can look it up and find exactly what I found. But it's not a complex whiskey. It's a very good whiskey, however. And the last bottle I have is Maker's Mark Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. This is the same bourbon that we saw on the 46, except this is just aging to taste. They age it to taste. They don't age it for a set number of years. I don't know if it has anything on the label about that. I don't see anything. But this whiskey is a wheated bourbon. It's the first wheated bourbon I ever had. And because it uses wheat instead of rye, it's softer, it's gentler, it's not as spicy, it's sweeter. And I find that just as I have a sweet tooth in other areas, orange, vanilla, Coke, just as I like my cakes and my pies and such like, I find I like a sweeter whiskey, and, which is one reason I started buying Balcones, because their pot still bourbon is so nice and sweet. The brimstone isn't, the lineage isn't, although they have sweet notes in there, but they're in that same basic Balcones profile. This Maker's Mark is definitely a sweet whiskey. And also, just while we're here, I want to show, I don't know how good you'll be able to see it, but I want to show you the sides of the label. It's one of the nicer labels I've got. It's not as bold and bright and distinctive as the Balcones labels, but I like their label. But, wheated bourbon, good whiskey. At one point, it was my very favorite whiskey until I tried the Balcones pot still bourbon. And ever since then, my favorite whiskey has been a Balcones product. So those are the whiskeys I have on hand. My comments, I tried to be brief about each one, and some other stuff on the side. As I say, I'm talking about something that interests me. Maybe it will also interest you to hear me talk about something that interests me.